All right, welcome to our last module on the Americas. Um, this is another uh, preview that really could spend at least an entire semester on. There's a lot of material in here that really would take more of an expert and someone who is just completely focused on this. So what I have to do in this is really skim over things once again to give you the most important pieces that are looked at within these cultures. And we're going to be dividing it up between North, Central, and South America. So with this, it's a really quick overview, and things that won't be covered are sometimes tribes that, as they get closer to 1300s and any interactions with the Aztecs. So we're looking at a lot like pre-Columbian civilizations. So we'll get started here. And in this module, um, these notes, like I said, are going to cover Mesoamerica, South America, North America, and most of the major pieces that we know of and find. There's a lot of history here. There's a lot to cover, and with that, I'm just going to try to give you like how they connect, how they sort of blend in with one another, how they influence one another, and really some of the most major and sort of, in some ways, very fantastic things that were built. So we're going to start in Mesoamerica, and this area is current-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador. The Olmec people are really where we sort of put a pin in and say, okay, this is the beginning culture, known as the mother culture, that later tribes not only claim descendancy from, but we can see either iconographically or through rituals and daily life that there's a connection to that. So the Olmec have a large expanse, and the society that they built is quite stunning. They have large pyramids, they have ball courts, and this is an example of one of the many stone heads that they left. It's colossal in scale, and there are many that are left, and they're surviving because they're so big. But they're guessing that these were probably Olmec rulers, and each of these stones weighs about 10 tons and is made from basalt. Another one of these situations where stones are carried for a long distance. So I always find that those things are very interesting, that whether it's Stonehenge or Egypt or in this case, Mesoamerica, the idea of there must be something almost ritualistic about bringing something so big from a distance, not just because of the quarries, but there must be, in my opinion, something that's, like I said, more ritualistic about it, to say, this is some of our power, some of our might. This is how much this person means to us when we're going to go this far and carry something so heavy back. The Olmec people are sometimes credited with building or starting Teotihuacan. Teotihuacan is very much a mystery that's still being uncovered. It is known that many different tribes lived in this place at one time, and you can see from the photo that it's no small feat. So it would have taken some time to build it up, but it would have been considered sort of like a metropolis. The origins of this is not really for certain, and it's documented by the Aztecs that when they find, so that the Aztecs, of course, which we won't really get into, but in their culture, when they find which will become Mexico City, but when they find their sort of omen of the serpent holding the snake in the tree, and they build their capital, this is only a little bit farther north of them, but very close by. And so they talk about stumbling in there and imagining like this place already being built by the gods. I mean, it's huge. And so they themselves are sort of in awe by it. ancient tribes called it the place of the gods, right? And the pyramids are constructed in a way that align with celestial bodies. This is the pyramid of the sun. There's a pyramid of the moon as well, and it's very easy to see how they've orientated things to the cardinal directions. There is a great series that I've put on your Canopy list, and it's a PBS series called The Americas. And each of the episodes kind of jumps around, but in the very first one, they talk about Teotihuacan, and I highly recommend watching this and kind of getting even further in depth about how this place was constructed. We could go into a lot of detail. There's still, like I said, a lot of studies going on about it. But what's really interesting is directly below it, in fact, directly below the center of it, is a cistern. And in that cistern is the cave walls have been painted. There's somewhat sort of like the impression of stars on the ceiling that also sort of align with celestial bodies. And it's very interesting, like how what sort of place of worship this must have been. And so there's a lot of information about it. But Teotihuacan is sort of one of those early monuments that all the tribes is sort of linked back to. So we've talked before about the ceremonial mountain, and here we're seeing that again with this pyramid. And it's really cool because the city is also set on a grid. It's spread out over 9 miles. And the earliest writing that they find there, we still haven't deciphered. So now, an interesting feature of Teotihuacan is what's known as the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, which is in the upper right, and in the lower right is a painting of Quetzalcoatl, and he is known as a feathered serpent. So here's the eyes, the nose, right, and the headdress that's coming out. But Quetzalcoatl's head is also along here as well. And Quetzalcoatl is also adopted by the Aztecs, also by the Mayans, and is very much sort of like they're sort of, let's call it like a Zeus sort of character. What's kind of cool is at a certain time of year, there are some temples to Quetzalcoatl that the head and the way the shadows play, and it looks like the serpent is slithering down the steps by the way the shadows sort of line up on it. So probably very much so made that on purpose, but just because these buildings are built so precisely. They have found human remains around these temples, and to talk a little bit about human sacrifice, there's sort of this notion within sort of their beliefs is that, and especially in Mayan belief, is that the god of the sun is also the same ruler of corn. And in the myth, the idea that the sun god, he rises up and during the day, and then he battles the moon and he dies, and he sheds his blood to the earth, so that way things like corn can grow for human beings, and at night then there's this rebirth process, right? And so if the gods are sort of sacrificing for the people below, then the people themselves also need to give a sacrifice. And so this is done ritualistically with human sacrifice, human blood, and these sort of things, while grotesque in nature, a lot of them weren't necessarily meant to be. And you could say that sometimes it was probably an honor to be, quote unquote, the sacrificed one. Slaves were used, though, captives, sometimes people from the villages, younger girls, babies. Sometimes it really sort of depended, but it really wasn't seen so much as like this bloodthirsty, malicious act, as it is sort of a way of ensuring the harvest the next day, and these sort of beliefs. One thing is that the sacrifice may have also been in sort of a funerary practice like the Egyptians, in where important people associated with the dead are sacrificed to serve in the afterlife. So there's a there's other connotations with it, but images done in murals and the carvings that adorn the temples of the gods. So that's what I'm kind of showing you on the right. And they're highly decorated and show distinct style and representation of the religious beliefs. There's lots of pattern, usually are very symmetrical in composition. They're flat in color, and they're not really interested in showing naturalism in like perfect human proportions or anything like that. They're really showing more their belief structure within the images that they create. The Mayans themselves will create something called Mayan blue, which is a pigment that is very specific to them, and so we see that used within their murals that we'll talk more about. But the murals themselves definitely are sort of like a way of recording and are very symbolic to them. The Mayan culture, they're really known for their steep and really vast pyramid. They are the first culture that really sort of moves around, takes up a lot, builds many cities. In fact, many are still being discovered within the jungle. I mean, yes, they are around for really 600 years, but they never really go away because people today still speak Mayan, so it's still around. But they're really known for the starting of the ball courts as a game, and I have a video link on your Moodle shell that shows the game being played and how that is. It's sort of a combination of soccer and basketball, and it's quite interesting, which usually the victor gets to stay alive, and the one who loses the game, they get sacrificed. So that did happen. Not always, but it did happen. Their imagery also centered around depicting gods, or sorry, they're depicting rulers, not gods. And they have a lot of murals and reliefs of everyday life. They also have their own very sophisticated form of writing, which luckily was decoded in its pictographs, and so to this day, all those pictographs, which are usually adorning these stone buildings in relief context, are able to be read and understood. And it talks a lot about not only like the rulers and what they did, but also like why a temple was maybe dedicated. So there's a lot of writing that we know about them. They're very advanced in mathematics and astronomy. And like I said, the civilization goes away around 900, but there's still people speaking it today. What's kind of interesting is that the Mayans, when they built a city, many times they warred with each other. They had a lot of just sort of like, you can imagine like the city leader, the king of that area, and they would sort of kind of go fight with those that are closest to them. At one point in there, they also hire Aztecs help, and then once the Aztecs have sort of defeated a certain group of Mayans, and they kind of turn themselves on the other group. So it's kind of a sad sort of story for them. But we've seen these step temples before, though. This is something I want us to remember, going all the way back to Mesopotamia and seeing it again in Egypt. The stepped pyramid, the sacred mountain, the steps ascending to heaven, right? It is a common form, a very common symbol that is used. So I find that fascinating in the human mind, that even though different beliefs, we're still using a similar form to represent those beliefs, or that idea of sacred space between heaven and earth. Talked a little bit about ball courts, and these ball courts really range in sizes and shapes. There's a T shape or an I shape, and I would just highly recommend watching that video and give you a better idea of how it's played. But the ball is created from rubber. There are many rubber trees. If you've ever seen a rubber tree before, it's really interesting how you can sort of bleed the tree and gather up that sap, which is, when dried, is rubber. It can be heated, boiled to a consistency. While little is known about all the rules and the amount of players, the murals help with the reconstruction. Those pictographs help understand. But it's, like I said, it's similar to soccer in that you can't use your hands to touch the ball. But with this hoop located up on the wall, usually it's used between the knees and the hips to try to and shoot it, pass it in ways to a player on the side. And when you score, the ball then goes to the other team to see if they can sort of control it. And if they can't, and they happen to lose the ball or it spills over to the other team, then they kind of keep going, and whoever has the most points after probably a certain set of time, wins. But the game is symbolically played to recreate a mythology from the people and their beliefs about two brothers who had to play the gods through this game that they designed. And like I said before, some end in ritualistic sacrifice. So, but the ball courts, if you've ever gone to any of these ruins and been to, actually, if you ever make it away to Cancun, you can go to Chichen Itza, and that's one of the larger Mayan ruins. And you can walk through those ball courts, and you can see these pyramids and the architecture. And the pyramids themselves are very, very, very steep. But the ball courts themselves are also pretty grand in scale. So Mayan imagery, very interesting. They're very well known for their stone relief carvings, these murals. And what's nice about it being in relief is that for preservation, we have a lot. Now, what you see actually right here is those Mayan pictograph writings, right? So we have this narration for the images. They give us a lot of understanding of the everyday life and what's going on. And for example, in this one, this is one panel of a series, and I've given you there's a video on Moodle that I've linked for this, but Lady Ox, as she's referred to, she's actually a female leader for the Mayan people, and what you're seeing depicted is a bloodletting ceremony. Now, in Mayan culture, when you are a leader, you are expected to be able to commune with the gods, be able to talk with them. And the way that you talk is by giving blood, or you have a conversation with them is by giving blood. Not to get too gory in detail, but just to give you sort of the examples, is that if you were a male leader, you would have to sometimes lacerate yourself on your penis and stuff. Usually it was pierced with a piece of obsidian, and that bloodletting is meant that a lot of blood needed to be given, because really what it does is it puts the body into after you lose so much, you become delirious, and it goes into sort of what they consider a transcendental state. A lot of the times the leaders were also locked up in sort of like a dark place and just kind of like left to their imagination while they're also bleeding out a little bit. It's not like a physician was right there by them, right? They kind of they kind of run the gamut with it. But there's also ways where they would take a rope that at the end would have a sharp point of obsidian, and then the rope itself would have smaller pieces of obsidian, and it'd be pierced through the tongue. And that's what we see Lady Ox doing right here. She has pierced her tongue, and you can see the sharp barbs on this rope as she's pulling it through. And what that's doing is creating more and more and more cuts. So you're just bleeding profusely. And this apparition that she's seeing, right, this either other warrior or this other individual above her is sort of a part of that hallucination. Like, here's her being able to commune with the gods. But they would receive instruction, and then they'd be able to go relay it back to the people. So you had to do this as a leader. You did not have an option, which maybe our leaders should also do. Like, just realize, like, hey, yeah, maybe that's what you need to be, like, the standard. You don't get a paycheck, you get to do bloodletting. So pretty crazy, but for us to think about. But that's what we're seeing depicted. And this is a really interesting story about her. And like I said, it's one of, I think, 36 panels. Another tribe, the Toltecs. This civilization really moved in after the Mayans. We kind of started to see their downfall a little bit. One thing that really helped with it, their rise is what's called the Atlatl. and you'll need to know that for the test. And that is a sort of stick with a handle on it that is notched, and you can put in a spear that fits into that notch, and you're able to throw the spear, not holding it by your hand, but holding that atlatl handle. And what that does is allow it to be like flipped and like almost like slingshotted even harder and faster. So it became a really dominant weapon for the time period. They didn't have a capital city, or sorry, they did have a capital city in Tula, but the city was destroyed and burned after the Toltecs had left for reasons we don't know. The Aztecs followed the Toltecs and claimed to be descendants of them. So there may be something. So, but they're kind of one of those other anomalies or mysteries that still trying to find information on. As we move to South America, cultures in South America are older than in Mesoamerica, and they've mastered the technologies like metalwork, monument building, and sophisticated paintings and sculptures. And so their demise was really at the hand of the Spaniards. And what we know is a culture called the Chavín culture. These are in the Andes Mountains, and then for that region, they're known as the mother culture of the South America. They built their temples and had a lot of carvings. When you look at this, you may say, "Well, it's similar to Mayan in many ways." And they had a lot of these carvings that were part man, part animal. And this stela that we're seeing here, and I've given you not only the image of it, but then sort of the high, or just sort of the high resolution of it in black and white to give you the contrast, because we can't really see the details so well. And what's really cool about the work that they created is that it's meant to be seen in sort of a dual purpose. So when we look down here, we see the individual, and it looks like an amazing headdress. And then when we flip it around, right, we see the sort of demon person. Here's the eyes, here's the open mouth, and all the multiple legs, right? And so they created this sort of duality. This being the most famous, and it's a low relief of a god holding a staff, which we see right here, God holding the staff. And when viewed upside down, right, we create this new sort of character. So it's almost like a good and evil representation. And what's really kind of cool or to note about them is that the images created by them have been found hundreds of miles from the areas in which they lived, which either means that they were trading, right, or that it kind of gives us an idea of as their downfall happened, where these pieces went, who was taking them. But really, really sort of interesting work. Some of the most famous, popular right now for tourists to go and see are the Nazca people. Two things that they're very famous for, and there is also another video of them on your Moodle shell. But one is the pottery. The pottery is really interesting because it's highly decorated, it's bright, it's colorful, it has an interesting form to it. Nazca pottery always has these two spouts coming from the top connected by a handle, so it's very iconographic of their work. And the images of animals and plants or mythological creatures are on them. You can see that smooth, glossy finish, which usually comes from burnishing the clay before it's fired. But I find these interesting because it's a little bit more form over function. You look at a vessel like this and you're kind of wondering how it was used. And especially since the thing on there is more about mythology, it makes me sort of wonder if maybe these are a little bit more ceremonial. The second thing that they're most notable for are what's called the Nazca lines. And these are very large-scale earthworks that are drawn on the surface of Earth. And what we're seeing is from the view of an airplane up above. And in specific valleys, there's been documented over 200 of these. And because what's kind of interesting is that the soil is very dark, but if you just kind of remove just a couple inches of soil, you get there's a white crust underneath that soil. So it makes a really good contrast. And so the peoples would kind of, well, they would they'd map out and draw out these sort of symbols. Um, some are very much sort of like animals, very similar to their ceramics, where you have animals or plants or things being depicted. We'd see things like hummingbirds. In fact, lots of birds are primarily it. But these symbols, you'd have to say, well, they must be making them for the gods because only the gods could be able to see them. And that's kind of interesting. We haven't seen peoples really make stuff for the intent of the viewer from up above. So, especially at this size. I mean, they're very hundreds of yards long in areas. So, I mean, there's some mapping that's taking place to create these. It's not just like kids running around on the weekend or something. As we move into North America, which is really the more early, and I've seen some research saying that people didn't really live in North America. Why? Well, we see it older in something like Mesoamerica or South America, is because North America itself is still sort of thawing, I guess is the best way you could say. So people had, kind of moved through it, especially when you think of that land bridge, where we think of like people came over sort of the Bering Strait and then, came down slowly. Why wouldn't they have stopped there first? Why did they keep going when we see older civilizations and stuff happening? That's not to say there's not old civilizations in North America, but not as old as what we see, like Teotihuacan or the Shaman people. So North America can be traced back to 10,000 BCE. The problem is that just a lot of stuff doesn't remain. The materials, depending on how they're living. The Inuit peoples of the north, Eskimo is more of a term that we use that can be considered a little derogatory. So I use that term just so we're understanding what we're talking about, but I don't use it in a derogatory way. But they've been working date back to about 500 BCE, and a lot of their stuff is preserved because of ivory carvings. The east of the Mississippi River, the Adena peoples, they left their marks with a lot of small carvings. There's some images in your book on that. And the earliest are really these burial mounds. So the Mississippian culture, it's quite amazing because there are over 10,000 mounds in the United States, and they're earth mounds. They're not sure really if they're even burial mounds, but we do know that at least there's something like this, which is an effigy mound, and this is another form of where we see that tail at snake, and it's to become a snake. So very similar to like the Nazca lines, not in the same scale, but that PBS special is talking about. They also do some really interesting work about North America and the burial mounds there. So please check that out because that gives you a lot of great information. The Southwest really has sort of some of the richest artifacts for us when it comes to the early peoples of the United States or of North America. And the strongest tradition is in pottery. And the Mimbres people, they created these bowls in this style of pottery, and very popular once again because of the image, the high contrast, the designs. But what's really interesting about these pieces is that you can see that there's these puncture marks in it. I mean, it's very easy to see the one here, but these puncture marks are a way of what they know is called killing the vessel. And so there's not really reason known why, but a lot of these have been found at grave sites or sort of in what seems to be like in a ceremonial way. To me, it's very interesting that there would be a function, something that would serve everyday life, and then it would be, broken. you think of the time and the work that would go through it, and why, there's a lot of questions that come to mind why you do that. But um, I added some of the image there because this was pretty interesting to me, where someone's giving birth, and then there's a hole in it. So it makes me wonder if maybe it didn't go right, whether maybe the baby died or maybe the mother died, and so then the bowl that was used to sort of like honor them was then sort of killed. Some have speculated the bowls are placed over the face, and the face, then there would be the spirit would be able to leave through that hole and then enter in again. So there are some theories about like why these are done this way. But the greatest sites that we have are Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. If you really want a great trip, whether in the summer or sometime, make your way to the Four Corners area of the United States, and you'll find there's thousands of sites, ancient sites between the Anasazi and Pueblo that are around. The two largest one, Mesa Verde, is a national park. It's near Cortez, Colorado, and is led to believe that you have the ancestral Pueblo that lived there. And that's an interesting group because they sort of disappeared, whether they sort of were integrated into other tribes or just kind of stopped living the way they did and moved on. It's very interesting, but they built these in Mesa Verde and in Chaco Canyon. More in Mesa Verde are cliff palaces. Chaco Canyon has a similar architecture, but not always in the cliffs. And what's interesting is that these are very large urban settings. Now, the most important thing to know is a structure called the kiva. And a kiva is a pit in the earth, this circular pit right here that's cut down into the earth, carved away, and then it's covered over with a roof, and there's a hole in the top. Now, some kivas are very much like everyday life, and some are also used as sort of like a ceremonial meeting place. But the kiva itself is interesting because like Mesa Verde, in their largest area, there's several kivas, and you can imagine living and coming out through the earth, and that's a part of their belief, is this idea that we're born of the earth. And so every day you're kind of going in and out of the earth, and it's a pretty interesting structure. I'm going to show you some images here of those. So here's Mesa Verde, and you can see down here some of these kivas that would have been covered. Also, here in the sides, there are makeshift ladders carved into the stone, because up here is where the farming would have taken place. It is speculated that maybe there was a lot of warring or raiding tribes at this time, and so this was built for protection. Maybe there was a climate issue, but then these places were just abandoned. There's artifacts and such there, and so excavations are still going on, but they were abandoned. Now, Chaco Canyon is massive. This is the largest structure that is there, but there are several similar to this, and you can see the kivas once again lining around. Now, there's a wall here, and everything in Chaco Canyon is very, very specific. And you need to watch the films on it, not only that I put it on the Moodle show, but on that America's special, just because there's an amazing center that Chaco Canyon is. Chaco Canyon has roads that lead to it that were handmade, that are straight as an arrow and go for hundreds of miles. Chaco Canyon also has artifacts from several different time periods, from several different cultures all over North America, Central America, and South America. So we know that trade was happening, but we also know that people were traveling to this as a site. So it's believed that Chaco Canyon was truly kind of like a ancient Mecca for these people, that going to there had some spiritual nature about it. It's amazing. I've been to this site, and it's really sort of out in the middle of nowhere, and there are several of these buildings, and all over are very celestial aligned buildings, and you can see the stars in a way that is very spectacular, I should say. So it's worth the trip to go and Chaco Canyon. I don't even know if it has a fee anymore, but um, just an amazing thing that you should definitely check out. So that's a quick brief of the Americas, and thank you so much for kind of getting to this course. Like I said, I wish that we could spend semesters on these, but unfortunately, we don't have the time. So thank you for sitting through the survey class, and hope you can find all the resources that I've posted, and those can be helpful to you for either your research or just for your general interest.